In the autumn of 2022, a truck climbed a dirt track into the eastern Rhodope mountains of southern Bulgaria, carrying wooden crates lashed down in the back. Inside those crates were cinereous vultures, birds with a wingspan approaching 3 meters. Birds that weigh as much as a small dog and can cross 100 kilometers of mountain in a morning without a single wing beat of effort. They were carried up to a fenced enclosure on a slope above a river valley, and they were released into mountains that had not held a nesting pair of their species since 1993. Not a small population, not a struggling one. None. For 29 years, no cinereous vulture had hatched, fledged, or been raised anywhere in this landscape. The species was written off here, locally extinct, a line in a report. Over the 4 years that followed, Bulgaria released 40 of them into those mountains. And in April 2026, a survey team walking those same valleys found 3 nests with chicks in them. This is the story of the 33-year gap between those two facts, and of the hand-built wooden platforms bolted into pine trees on ropes that turned out to be the reason it closed. The eastern Rhodopes are one of the last large, low-population landscapes in the Balkans. Oak and pine ridges, deep gorges, thin villages, and a livestock tradition that has been thinning out for 50 years. On the 15th of April, 2026, the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds confirmed what its field teams had been quietly watching all winter. 3 pairs of cinereous vultures had hatched chicks. It was the first confirmed nesting of the species in the eastern Rhodopes since 1993. A word on what gone means here, because it matters. Cinereous vultures were still occasionally seen over the Rhodopes, young birds drifting north out of Greece and Turkey, passing through, moving on. What the mountains had not held since 1993 was a pair that stopped, chose a tree, and raised a chick. The birds appeared. Nothing nested. 8 pairs were recorded across the area that season. 5 of them held territory without producing young. 3 built nests, laid and hatched. 3 nests, and 7 of those 8 pairs were sitting in structures that human beings had built for them. Most coverage of this story stopped at the headline. Vultures return to Bulgaria. Nice photo, warm feeling. Scroll on. What almost nobody explained is why it took 33 years, why 7 of the 8 pairs chose an artificial platform over a real branch, why 5 more birds had to be driven across a continent in May 2026, and what actually happens to a mountain range when you put its cleanup crew back into it. The Bulgarian reporting in this video comes from the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds. April 2026 announcement, rewilding Europe's coverage from July, the Vulture Conservation Foundation's mid-July update on the chicks, and the published structure of the €4.16 million LIFE project funding the work through 2029. The vulture biology and the wider collapse are drawn from the peer-reviewed literature cited in the description. But before any of that makes sense, you need to understand why losing this particular bird is not like losing a pretty bird. The cinereous vulture, Aegypius monicus, is not a scavenger in the way a crow is a scavenger. It is the largest bird of prey in Europe, a wingspan of 2.5 to 3 meters, a body weight between 7 and 14 kilograms, a hooked bill strong enough to open the hide of a dead cow, which is a job almost no other bird on the continent can do. That detail matters more than it sounds. Griffon vultures, the other large vulture of the Balkans, feed on soft tissue. They need the carcass to be open before they can work. The cinereous vulture is the one that opens it. Remove it, and the whole scavenging sequence downstream slows. It also searches differently. It does not flap across a mountain range. It rides columns of rising air, climbing inside one and gliding down toward the next, converting height into distance for almost no energy, which is how a single bird can cover an enormous area in a day and be the first thing to arrive at something that died overnight. Its digestive system is a biological hazard facility. Stomach acid strong enough to destroy anthrax spores, botulinum toxin, brucellosis, and the bacteria of advanced decay. A vulture can eat something that would kill a wolf, a dog, or a person and walk away from it. What goes into a vulture does not come out into the water table. They are slow breeders. A pair produces 1 egg a year. 1. The chick takes around 120 days to fledge, and the parents feed it for months afterward. Pairs bond long-term and can live for decades. That is the whole strategy. produce very little, very slowly, and live long enough for it to add up. It works in a stable landscape. It collapses in an unstable one because there is no reproductive burst to recover with. And unlike the griffin, the cinereous vulture does not nest on a cliff. It nests in a tree, a large, old, flat-topped pine or oak, strong enough to hold a nest 1.5 meters across. Hold on to that. It becomes the whole engineering problem later in this video, because a bird that lays 1 egg a year needs a specific ancient tree and eats only the dead is a bird with almost no margin for error. Bulgaria removed the margin. Across the 20th century, the cinereous vulture disappeared from most of Europe. Not by accident, the mechanism was poison bait. From the 1950s onward, campaigns against wolves, jackals, and foxes across the Balkans put poisoned carcasses out in the open landscape on a systematic basis. It is an efficient way to kill a predator. It is a far more efficient way to kill a vulture, because a vulture is designed to find dead things faster than anything else alive. And vultures watch each other. A descending bird is a signal that travels for kilometers, so a bait set for a single fox does not kill one vulture. It pulls in everything within sight of the first arrival. A single poisoned carcass could kill an entire local population in an afternoon. At the same time, the food base collapsed. Extensive livestock grazing, sheep and goats moving across open mountain, dying where they fell, gave way to intensive farming, enclosed stock, and sanitation regulations that required carcasses to be removed and destroyed. The mountains were cleaned up. For a vulture, cleaned up means emptied. Add shooting, nest disturbance, and the felling of the old, wide-crowned trees the birds needed, and the arithmetic finished itself. Each pressure alone was survivable. Together they removed the food, the nest sites, and the adults at once from a species that could replace an adult only once a year at best. By 1993, the last known breeding attempt in the eastern Rhodopes was over. Bulgaria still had griffin vultures in small numbers and would later recover them. The cinereous vulture was simply gone as a breeding bird. And here is the part that has only become clear recently. When you delete a continent's scavengers, you do not get a slightly untidier landscape. You get a public health event. In India, the collapse of vulture populations after the 1990s left tens of millions of carcasses to be processed by feral dogs and rats instead. Rabies exposure rose. Peer-reviewed work published in 2024 estimated the human death toll of that collapse in the hundreds of thousands. Vultures are not a sentimental addition to a mountain range. They are sanitation. By the 2010s, conservation teams in Bulgaria had a specific and unusual problem. The threats were largely fixable. Poison bait use had fallen sharply and was being actively policed. Griffin vulture numbers in the Rhodopes were climbing. Supplementary feeding sites had been established. The habitat was still there, the gorges, the oak ridges, the old pines. What was missing was the birds. And there is a reason the griffins came back and the cinereous vultures did not. Griffins nest on cliffs, in colonies, and the Balkans still held remnant groups close enough to spread from. Cinereous vultures nest in trees, in loose dispersed groups, and the nearest strong population sits in central Spain, over 3,000 kilometers west. There was nothing left nearby to spread from. The species is also conservative about where it settles. Young birds prospect for years, and they overwhelmingly choose to nest where other cinereous vultures already are, because an established pair is the only reliable evidence a young bird has that a place actually works. A landscape with 0 pairs sends 0 signal. The habitat was ready and empty, and it would stay ready and empty indefinitely, because there was nobody there to tell the next generation it was worth stopping. The species could not come back on its own. It had to be carried. The program that followed is run by the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds, together with Rewilding Rhodopes, the Spanish wildlife recovery organization GREFA, and Rewilding Europe, inside a life-funded project worth 4.16 million euros and scheduled to run through 2029. The method has 3 parts, and none of them works without the other 2. First, the birds. Cinereous vultures are sourced from Spain, a mix of rehabilitated wild birds and captive-bred individuals from the recovery network, then transported to Bulgaria and held in a large, open-topped acclimatization aviary in the release area. They are not simply let out of a box. They spend weeks in the enclosure, learning the skyline, the ridge lines, the position of the feeding sites, so that the landscape they eventually fly over is one they already recognize. A bird released cold into unfamiliar mountains has no reason to stay in them. Weeks of looking at the same ridge from the same perch turns an arbitrary place into a known one. Second, the food. Supplementary feeding stations keep a reliable, uncontaminated carcass supply in the release zone so that a newly released bird does not have to gamble its first month on chance. It is also a control measure. A bird reliably fed at a known clean site is less likely to find an unknown poisoned one. Third, and this is the piece almost nobody covers, the nests. Remember the biology. This species needs a large, flat-crowned tree with a strong lateral branch structure. Across the eastern Rhodopes, decades of logging and fire have left plenty of forest but relatively few trees of the right age and architecture. Even a perfect pair of birds in a perfect valley can fail simply because there is nowhere structurally adequate to put a nest. So the teams built them. Artificial nesting platforms, hand-assembled timber frames, hauled up slopes, climbed into selected pines, bolted into place, and packed with branches to give a founding pair a viable starting structure that a wild tree would have taken a century to grow. Placement is not casual. A platform has to sit where a bird would have chosen anyway. The right height, a clear approach for an animal with a 3-meter wingspan, near enough to the feeding sites, far enough from human traffic. Get it wrong and you have bolted a heavy wooden box into a tree no vulture will ever look at twice. It is unglamorous work. Rope, timber, a chainsaw, and a long walk uphill. It also turned out to be the single highest leverage intervention in the entire project. To understand the scale of effort behind each individual bird, look at what happened in May 2026, a month after the nests were found. 5 cinereous vultures were selected in Spain for transfer to Bulgaria. They were not flown. Air transport is stressful, badly suited to birds of that size, and difficult to control. They were driven. 3,300 kilometers across the width of Europe over 3 days. A vehicle, a rotating crew, scheduled checks, temperature control, and 5 of the largest raptors on the continent sitting in the back in transport crates while Spain, France, Italy, and the Balkans went past outside. 3 days on the road for 5 birds. That is the actual exchange rate of this kind of restoration, not a press release and a ribbon. A van, a driver rota, and 72 hours of continuous responsibility for 5 animals, repeated until the numbers add up. Since 2022, 40 cinereous vultures have been released into the eastern Rhodopes this way, 35 of them before the 2026 breeding season, and 5 more driven in behind them once the first chicks were already in the nest. And that is the answer to why 5 more had to be driven across a continent in a year that had already produced chicks. 3 nests is not a population. 8 pairs built from 35 released birds is a founder group thin enough that a single bad season or a single poisoning takes it back to 0, and a group that's small carries a narrow slice of the species' genetic variation into every generation after it. The releases were never scheduled to stop when the first chick hatched. They are scheduled to stop in 2029. The first chick was the signal to keep going, not to finish. For the first years, the returns were invisible. Released birds dispersed. Some wandered hundreds of kilometers and came back. Some were lost. Cinereous vultures do not reach breeding age quickly. Birds typically need 4 to 5 years before they attempt to nest, which means that from the very first release in 2022, the earliest realistic date for a chick was somewhere in the second half of the decade. The project was structurally required to look like a failure for years before it could look like anything else. Every season in between produced the same report: birds present, birds surviving, no breeding. That is indistinguishable from the beginning of a failure right up until the moment it isn't. Then came the 2026 breeding season, 8 pairs on territory in the eastern Rhodopes, and on the 15th of April, the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds confirmed it. 3 nests, 3 chicks, hatched. The first cinereous vultures born in this landscape since 1993, 33 years, 40 released birds, 3 nests, and of the 8 pairs, 7 were sitting in artificial platforms, 7 out of 8. And that is the answer to the question the numbers raise. The birds did not prefer human timber to a living branch. They chose the best available structure in a forest that has very few of them left. A century of logging and fire removed the old wide-crowned trees faster than the forest could replace them. The platforms were not competing with good trees. They were standing in for trees that no longer exist. The wooden frames were not a supporting detail. They were the thing that converted birds in the sky into birds on eggs. By the middle of July, the Vulture Conservation Foundation confirmed the outcome. 2 of the 3 chicks had survived to fledging age. Both were fitted with GPS transmitters before leaving the nest. 2 birds, which sounds like almost nothing, but it is not nothing, and the reason has very little to do with the number 2. Everything up to this point is the story that got reported. Vultures released, vultures bred, chicks tagged, good news in a hard decade. That is the surface. What it misses is that a first successful nest is not a result, it is a switch. The first thing that changes is the signal. Cinereous vultures settle where cinereous vultures already are. An empty landscape recruits nobody. A landscape with active nests recruits continuously. Passing juveniles from Greece, Turkey, and the wider Balkan range now have a reason to stop, and the released birds themselves have a reason to stay. 3 nests do not add 3 birds. They change the probability of every bird that flies over for the next 20 years. The Rhodopes have gone from a place that is invisible to a prospecting vulture to a place that advertises. The second thing that changes is the knowledge. Nest site selection, timing, and technique are learned as much as inherited. A population that is bred once has individuals who know how to do it in this specific landscape, and chicks raised in these mountains will prospect in these mountains. That is why the GPS tags on the 2 survivors matter far more than 2 birds should. They are the first data on where a Rhodope-hatched cinereous vulture actually goes, and every future decision about where to build the next platform depends on the answer. The third thing is the landscape function, and this is where the India comparison comes back. With griffons already recovering and cinereous vultures now breeding, the eastern Rhodopes have something almost nowhere else in the Balkans has: a complete scavenger guild. The large opener and the bulk feeders, working the same carcasses in the same valleys. In practice, that means a dead animal in these mountains is now found within hours, opened by a bird capable of opening it, and stripped by a flock whose stomachs destroy what is in it. What used to sit on a hillside for a fortnight feeding foxes, dogs, crows, and flies, and leaching into the water below it, is gone by the afternoon, and the pathogens go with it. That is the loop that broke here in 1993, and it is a loop that has only ever been rebuilt in a handful of places in Europe. It is worth being precise about what has and has not been demonstrated. 3 nests is 3 nests, 2 fledglings is 2 fledglings. This is not yet a self-sustaining population, and it will not be one for a long time. A species that lays a single egg a year needs decades of consistent output before it can survive without help. The dependence on artificial platforms is real, and it is a vulnerability. 7 of 8 pairs used human infrastructure. That is a success of engineering and an open question about what happens in a landscape that still cannot grow enough of the right trees on its own. And poison bait has not been eliminated from the Balkans. It has been reduced. One incident at the wrong feeding site could undo several years of work in an afternoon. The life funding runs to 2029. What happens on the other side of that date is not yet written. But the direction is unambiguous, and the direction is what a first nest is for. The last cinereous vulture nest in the eastern Rhodopes failed in 1993. For 33 years after that, the mountains had the ridges, the gorges, the thermals, and the carcasses, and no bird large enough to open them. The real story here is not that 40 vultures were released. Releases happen constantly, in dozens of countries, and most of them produce nothing anybody remembers. The real story is that somebody looked at a mountain range that was structurally incapable of hosting the species it had lost and built the missing trees by hand. The real story is a 3-day drive across Europe for 5 birds, repeated until 40 of them were standing on Bulgarian rock. And the real story is 2 chicks with transmitters on their backs, flying over a valley where, for 3 decades, the answer to the question, "What nests here?" was Nothing does. They are not a symbol. They are working animals, doing the only job they have ever had, finding the dead before anything else does, and removing it from the landscape before it becomes a problem for everything still alive. 40 birds released into mountains that had not raised one since 1993. 7 wooden platforms bolted into pine trees by people on ropes. 3 nests, 2 transmitters, and a mountain range that, for the first time in 33 years, is raising its own. But Bulgaria is not the only place where a missing scavenger is being carried back into a landscape that forgot it. In our next video, we go to the Alps, where a bird that was deliberately, systematically shot out of existence by 1913 was reintroduced from 4 zoo-bred chicks, and where the population that grew from them is now doing something the reintroduction plan never predicted. If 40 vultures and 3 nests sound small, wait until you see what 4 chicks did to an entire mountain range across 4 countries.